Picture yourself sitting under a shady riverbank on a hot summer afternoon. A little girl named Alice, bored by her sister's dull book, notices a white rabbit wearing a waistcoat, muttering about being late. She follows him down a rabbit hole and tumbles into a world of chaos where nothing obeys ordinary logic. The adventure seems whimsical and nonsensical, yet every fantastical detail harbours the anxieties, obsessions, and injustices of Victorian society. Welcome to Alice in Wonderland, the dark meaning behind the madness. In this video, we will journey far beyond Disney's candy-coloured adaptation and into the darker inspirations behind Lewis Carroll's classic. You will discover how hallucinogenic drugs, neurological disorders, political wars, class prejudice, merciless schoolmasters, and even actual missing diary pages shaped Wonderland. By the end of our voyage, you will never look at Alice, the Mad Hatter, or the Queen of Hearts the same way again. Every legend begins with an author, and Alice's creator was as enigmatic as the characters he penned. Born Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, the Oxford mathematician who adopted the pen name Lewis Carroll was a shy, stammering intellectual who found solace in wordplay and puzzles. In 1856, he befriended Henry Liddell, the Dean of Christ Church, and soon became a favourite visitor to the deanery. Dodgson charmed the Liddell children Lorena, Ina, Alice and Edith, telling them fantastical tales on boat trips along the Thames. On July 4th, 1862, during one such outing, he improvised the bones of what would become Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. A few years later, he wrote down and published the story under the pseudonym Lewis Carroll. Dodgson kept meticulous diaries, and he used them to record his meetings, feelings, and creative ideas. Yet scholars discovered that several pages covering June 27th, 1863, were removed by unknown hands after his death. This has fueled scandalous speculation for more than a century. Theories abounded that Dodgson had proposed marriage to young Alice Liddell, and that the missing pages covered the resulting fallout. However, new evidence suggests otherwise. A note written by Dodgson's niece summarizing the missing page reveals that on that date, Mrs. Liddell informed him of damaging rumors implying he was using the children to court their governess or the teenage sister Ina. The note says nothing about a proposal to Alice. Instead, it summarizes gossip in Oxford society that he had overstayed his welcome by engaging improperly with an adult woman. After this confrontation, Dodgson's relationship with the Liddell family cooled for several months. The missing pages are thus less a romantic scandal and more evidence of Victorian social propriety and gossip. Dodgson was also an avid photographer at a time when photography was a painstaking and expensive hobby. Over the course of his life, he created around 3,000 photographs, and more than half depicted children. According to historians, roughly 30 of these pictures show children nude or semi-nude, though always with parental consent. In letters and diaries, he expressed a fascination with the innocence of childhood and cultivated friendships with many young girls. The majority of scholars argue that his affection was platonic, yet complex. Nevertheless, modern readers cannot ignore the uncomfortable undertones. A 2015 Guardian analysis observed that Dodgson often wrote letters telling little girls that he loved them and filled his diaries with details of his childish crushes. The missing diary page has thus been used by critics and defenders alike, some viewing it as evidence of suppressed scandal, and others as proof that the alleged proposal to Alice never happened. whatever the truth. The little riddle underscores how Victorian social norms and rumours have long coloured our understanding of Alice's origin. As we follow Alice down the rabbit hole, we cannot ignore the thick haze of opium smoke that pervaded Victorian Britain. In 19th century London, mind-altering substances were not hidden in dark alleys. They sat on pharmacy shelves next to cough syrup. In the 1800s, opium and its tincture, laudanum, were sold openly and without prescription. Historians describe laudanum as the aspirin of the 19th century. It was used for coughs, cholera, toothaches, menstrual cramps, melancholy, and everything in between. One Victorian druggist admitted selling 5 to 6 gallons of quietness each week, and mothers dosed infants with proprietary syrups, such as Godfrey's Cordial and Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. The Science Museum blog notes that these opium-laden concoctions were marketed as the poor child's nurse, and that unscrupulous vendors sold 20 to 25 drops of laudanum for a penny. Because opium suppressed crying and appetite, some infants literally shrank into little old men, leading to severe malnutrition and infant deaths. Before the 1868 Pharmacy Act, dangerous drugs could be purchased like any other commodity. By one estimate, 5 out of 6 Victorian families used opium habitually. When we return to Alice, the scenes of shrinking and growing, the hookah smoking caterpillar and the endless tea party take on darker hues. The caterpillar sits atop a mushroom, smoking a long pipe, exhaling rings of smoke that warp the air. In Victorian slang, an opium user was called a pipe dreamer, and many readers have interpreted the caterpillar as a symbol of laudanum intoxication. The book's disorienting shifts in scale mirror the hallucinations described by people consuming opium derivatives. Moreover, the Victorian public associated childhood with vulnerability to drug abuse. The ready availability of opiates meant that children could easily overdose. Dodgson was not known to be an opium user, but he lived in a society saturated with narcotics. His friend Arthur Conan Doyle would later write Sherlock Holmes stories featuring a detective who frequents opium dens. The cultural environment of widespread drug use may therefore have seeped into the dreamlike logic of Wonderland. By dramatizing disorientation and altered perception, Alice may be hinting at the moral hazards of self-medication and addiction. When Alice nibbles on the Eat Me cake and swallows the Drink Me bottle, she experiences extreme size changes that make her question her identity. In a time when mothers spooned laudanum into their babies' mouths, this cautionary tale becomes a metaphor for losing oneself to intoxicants. The book's famous line, "One side will make you grow taller, and the other side will make you grow shorter," echoes instructions for dosing opiates. The opium haze of Victorian life is thus an invisible character in the story, whispering that not all who wander in Wonderland are truly in control of their senses. "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" asks the Hatter at his perpetual tea party. Alice is baffled, and by the end of the chapter, the Mad Hatter confesses he does not know the answer. But behind his riddle lies a very real neurological tragedy that afflicted hatmakers across Europe. In the 19th century, felt hats were fashionable but difficult to manufacture. To transform animal fur into smooth felt, hatters treated pelts with mercurous nitrate. They then heated, agitated, and shaped the felt, releasing mercury vapor. At the time, no one understood that mercury is a neurotoxin. The phrase "mad as a hatter" predates Lewis Carroll's book and referred to the neurological symptoms hatters developed after years of exposure. A modern Discover magazine article explains that throughout the 1800s, hat makers used mercurous nitrate to cure felt. Prolonged inhalation of mercury fumes produced rashes, tremors, memory problems, and hallucinations. Doctors only identified the disease now known as erethism or Mad Hatter's disease around the 1950s. Long-term mercury poisoning leads to irritability, depression, slurred speech, unsteady gait, and sometimes psychosis. In Alice, the Hatter delivers nonsensical speeches, exhibits mood swings, and displays erratic behavior at the tea table. Victorian readers would have recognized this caricature. The Hatter's constant movement, changing seats at the table, because it's always tea time recalls the tremors and compulsive behaviors observed in real Hatters. His friend the March Hare also appears anxious and manic, an echo of industrial poisoning. By making the Hatter a central comic figure, Dodgson highlighted a hidden occupational hazard of his day. The Tea Party is frozen in time because the Hatter supposedly murdered time by singing badly at a concert given by the Queen of Hearts. As punishment, time halted at 6 o'clock, trapping the characters in endless tea. This absurd punishment can be read as a metaphor for the monotony of factory labor and the way industrial work warped workers' perception of time. For Hatters suffering mercury poisoning, time might indeed have seemed warped as tremors and hallucinations blurred reality. The Hatter's punny riddle, why is a raven like a writing desk, has no answer. It is a reflection of brain fog and the breakdown of logical reasoning. Through the Hatter, Dodgson critiques industrial toxicity and the loss of mental health, turning a public health crisis into dark humour. As we stroll through the Queen's croquet garden, we find playing cards frantically painting white roses red to appease their monarch. This comic scene conceals a centuries-old conflict soaked in blood. In the 15th century, two rival branches of the Plantagenet dynasty, the House of York and the House of Lancaster, waged a brutal civil war for the English throne. The Yorkists adopted a white rose as their emblem, while the Lancastrians used a red rose. The conflict lasted intermittently from 1455 to 1487 and culminated in battles like Towton, which historian estimates say may have been the largest and bloodiest battle on English soil. According to a historic UK article, the Battle of Towton on March 29, 1461, involved armies of approximately 25,000–35,000 men on each side, with a death toll around 28,000. The war ended when Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant, defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. Henry VII then married Elizabeth of York and adopted the Tudor rose, combining the red and white roses to symbolize unity. Shakespeare dramatized the rivalry in his Henry VI plays, where characters pluck red or white roses from a garden to declare their allegiance. The image of a garden and roses thus became shorthand for civil strife. In Alice, the Queen of Hearts is furious because the gardeners planted white roses by mistake. To avoid her wrath, off with their heads. The playing cards hurriedly paint the petals red. To Victorian readers aware of the Wars of the Roses, this would evoke the political necessity of aligning oneself with the victor. The white roses represent the Yorkists. Painting them red symbolizes subjugation by the Lancastrian faction. The scene satirizes blind obedience to tyrants and the rewriting of history. Just as Henry Tudor whitewashed the violent conflict by uniting the roses into the Tudor emblem, The card gardeners attempt to erase their mistake by painting over it. It is a visual pun about real blood being spilled to create political unity. The Queen of Hearts herself is a caricature of absolute monarchy. She constantly shrieks off with his head at the slightest offence, echoing the brutal executions of the Tudor period. Her capricious judgments and violent temper lampoon the arbitrary power of sovereigns. By setting her croquet match on a field of living flamingos, clubs, and hedgehogs, balls, Dodgson emphasizes the absurd cruelty of rulers who treat living beings as playthings. In a later chapter, the Queen presides over a mock trial whose verdict has already been written. The tarts are stolen, evidence is nonsensical, and the court's conclusion is predetermined. Through this grotesque parody, the book criticizes not only Tudor tyranny, but also Victorian legal injustice. How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail, recites Alice with perfect diction. She intends to quote a moralistic poem by Isaac Watts, but the words twist into nonsense. Even her multiplication table is wrong. Is this a child's dream or a schoolroom nightmare? Education in Victorian England was largely based on rote learning. Teachers drilled children through repetition and memorization, with little room for creativity or critical thinking. According to a University of Delaware literature wiki, children learned by memorizing what the teacher said, reciting it back, and being punished for mistakes. Wealthy boys were taught subjects like Latin and mathematics, while girls learned sewing and music. Ragged schools offered minimal instruction to poor children, and discipline was harsh. Students often endured physical punishments, like the cane for wrong answers, and classes were overcrowded. Dodgson himself taught at Oxford and valued logic and mathematics, but he disliked the inflexible curricula imposed on pupils. In the book, Alice tries to recite "How doth the little busy bee" from Isaac Watts' Divine Songs for Children, a didactic poem that uses a hard-working bee as a model for industriousness. Instead, she hears herself recite, "How doth the little crocodile improve his shining tail, and pour the waters of the Nile on every golden scale." The transformation of a bee into a crocodile satirizes moral instruction that fails to engage the child's imagination. The crocodile grins as it welcomes little fishes into its jaws, turning a lesson about industry into a vision of predation. This subtle subversion suggests that Victorian morality itself may be hypocritical or predatory. Later, the mock turtle quizzes Alice with the song "The Lobster Quadrille," and she has to recite her multiplication table. She says, 4 times 5 is 12, 4 times 6 is 13, and 4 times 7 is, oh dear. I shall never get to 20 at this rate. To the uninitiated, this seems nonsensical. 4 times 5 is certainly 20. However, mathematics historians point out that these equations are correct if you change the base of the number system. In base 18, 4 times 5 equals 12. In base 21, 4 times 6 equals 13. Dodgson, a mathematician, hid this joke as a critique of rote learning. He suggests that blindly memorizing tables without understanding the underlying concepts leads to confusion. The multiplication riddle also parodies the Victorian obsession with standardized exams. In Chapter 6, Alice encounters the Duchess violently shaking her baby, tossing pots and pans at the cook, and dosing the infant with pepper and soup. When Alice rescues the child, it transforms into a pig. Some scholars see this as a metaphor for the way Victorian society treated children dosed with drugs, subjected to neglect, and turned into something unrecognizable. The Victorian Web notes that infants dosed with opium often shrink up into little old men, and that high infant mortality was tragically common. The pig baby in Alice may thus be a dark joke about children ruined by harsh parenting and narcotics. "If any one of you can explain it," said Alice. She had grown so large in the last few minutes that she wasn't a bit afraid of interrupting him. "I'll give him sixpence. I don't believe there's an atom of meaning in it." She is speaking to a jury of playing cards, presided over by the Queen and King of Hearts. The evidence is a letter that contains no sense, yet they are prepared to convict the Knave of Hearts of stealing tarts. Victorian courts were harsh and uneven. An article from a historical blog about Victorian crime notes that the justice system was biased by class and gender. Wealthy and influential individuals often evaded serious punishment, while members of the lower classes, especially women, received harsh sentences for relatively minor offences. Public hangings were common until 1868, and petty criminals could be transported to penal colonies for stealing food. Women accused of prostitution or infanticide were vilified, while upper-class men could conceal their transgressions. This double standard is reflected in the trial scene of Alice. The knave is charged with stealing the Queen's tarts, but the evidence is absurd, a meaningless poem that the king calls the oldest rule in the book. The jury writes down "important" on their slates without understanding what is important. The king advises that a verdict should come before the sentence, an inversion of natural justice. Alice, who has grown large, calls out the nonsense. In the end, the courtroom dissolves into a pack of cards that blow about. Dodgson uses humour to show that the legal system can be a farce when power and class override fairness. Stories of poor people being sentenced to months of hard labour for stealing a loaf of bread were not mere legends. Old Bailey records show that petty theft could lead to imprisonment, whipping, or transportation. Meanwhile, corporate fraud or negligence by wealthy businessmen often resulted in minor fines. By turning the crime in Alice into the theft of tarts, essentially stolen pastries, Dodgson underscores the absurdity of a system that treats trivial property crimes as capital offences. Alice's interjection, offering sixpence to anyone who can make sense of the poem, mocks the notion that complex legal language confers legitimacy. Her ultimate contempt for the court. "Who cares for you?" said Alice. "You're nothing but a pack of cards," is a revolutionary act for a Victorian child, implying that unjust institutions can and should be challenged. It is also notable that the Queen of Hearts, who demands executions at every turn, epitomizes the stereotype of female hysteria. Victorian patriarchal culture often depicted powerful women as irrational, dangerous, and in need of male control. Dodgson simultaneously satirizes this sexist trope and uses it to highlight the cruelty of absolute monarchy. The King of Hearts sits beside the Queen, but offers little resistance to her tyranny. He is a timid figure whose occasional interjections are ignored. Through this gender dynamic, Alice lampoons both patriarchal expectations and the perils of giving unchecked power to any ruler, male or female. While interpreting Wonderland through social history offers profound insight, There is also a literal medical condition named after the story that alters how people perceive their own bodies and surroundings. Understanding this syndrome offers clues about the novel's uncanny descriptions of shifting size and warped reality. Alice in Wonderland syndrome, AIWS, is a rare neurological condition in which the brain's ability to process sensory input becomes disrupted. The Cleveland Clinic describes AIWS as a disorder that affects how you perceive the size of objects around you and the feel or look of your own body. It can also distort your sense of reality. The condition is named after Carroll's novel because sufferers describe feeling like Alice when she grows or shrinks after eating or drinking in Wonderland. Although AIWS can affect anyone, research suggests it is most common in children. According to the Cleveland Clinic, some studies indicate that nearly two-thirds of AIWS cases occur in people under 18 years old. The episodes are usually temporary, and there is limited research because symptoms often resolve before medical evaluation can occur. One study cited by the clinic mentions that up to 30 of teenagers may experience brief AIWS symptoms, though this figure needs further confirmation. Experts classify AIWS symptoms into three categories: disturbances in self-perception, disturbances in visual processing, and combined symptoms. Self-perception disturbances mean that people have trouble correctly perceiving the size or feel of their own body parts may feel too big, macrosomatognosia, or too small, microsomatognosia, or the whole body may seem unusually tall or short. These symptoms can also affect sense of reality, time perception, and emotional connection. Visual disturbances, which comprise about 75 of cases, make external objects appear smaller or larger than they are, or change their distance. Combined symptoms involve both self-perceptive and visual distortions. Although the name conjures images of fantasy, AIWS can be frightening. People may feel disconnected from their own bodies, depersonalization, experience derealization, or perceive time slowing down or speeding up. Medical researchers do not know exactly why AIWS occurs. The Cleveland Clinic lists multiple possible causes, including migraines, particularly migraine aura, infections, such as Epstein-Barr virus, influenza, chickenpox, Lyme disease, typhoid fever or scarlet fever, seizures or epilepsy, certain types of strokes, mental health conditions like schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder, medications, including cough medicines containing dextromethorphan or asthma drugs like montelukast, recreational drugs like LSD, brain tumors, and degenerative brain diseases. Because so many conditions can trigger AIWS, doctors treat the underlying cause rather than the syndrome itself. AIWS isn't contagious, and diagnosis is usually based on patient history and neurological exams because there are no formal criteria. Treatment involves addressing the root illness or discontinuing any offending drugs. Some commentators have speculated that Charles Dodgson himself may have experienced migraines or neurological episodes similar to AIWS. The Cleveland Clinic notes that his diary entries describe symptoms consistent with conditions that can cause AIWS. For example, he complained of seeing distorted images and experiencing feelings of unreality. However, because Dodgson died in 1898 and medical understanding was limited, we cannot know for certain whether he had AIWS. Whether or not he suffered from the syndrome, his portrayal of size distortion in Alice resonates powerfully with people who have experienced such episodes. The novel thus serves as both metaphor and description of an actual neurological phenomenon. It's a great, huge game of chess that's being played all over the world, if this is the world at all, says the Black Queen in Through the Looking Glass, Carroll's sequel to Alice in Wonderland. While the first book frames reality as a card game, the second frames it as a chess match. Both metaphors reveal the rigid hierarchies and imperial ambitions of the 19th century. In Through the Looking Glass, Alice steps through a mirror and discovers that the world beyond operates according to the rules of chess. She is a pawn, told she can become a queen if she moves forward 8 squares. Chess pieces symbolized social classes. Queens move freely and command power, while pawns are expendable. Victorian Britain itself was building an empire through colonization, treating distant lands as squares on a board to be conquered. Children's games thus mirrored adult geopolitics. By forcing Alice to adhere to arbitrary rules, Dodgson comments on the constraints placed on individuals by class, gender, and colonial power structures. The notion that a pawn can become a queen if she navigates the board's rules may be empowering, yet the game itself is still controlled by others. Throughout her adventures, Alice repeatedly asks, "Who in the world am I?" Ah, that's the great puzzle. She swells and shrinks, plays with animals as equals, questions authority figures, and sometimes becomes the adult in the room. Her identity crisis reflects the struggle of children who must conform to societal expectations as they mature. In the Victorian era, girls were expected to become demure wives and mothers, while boys were groomed for professions and politics. By giving Alice the agency to challenge patriarchs, the king and queen, teachers, the mock, turtle and griffin, and industrial masters, the Mad Hatter, Dodgson allows a female child to question and resist her prescribed role. This was a radical notion in the 1860s. In the Duchess's chaotic kitchen, gender roles are inverted. The cook hurls pots and pepper at everyone, subverting the stereotype of the nurturing woman. Meanwhile, the Duchess goes from violent temper to syrupy moralist, reciting, "Everybody mind your own business." The Cheshire Cat appears, grinning with malevolent detachment. This environment of unstable identities suggests that gender roles are performative rather than inherent. At a time when women had limited legal rights and the married woman's property belonged to her husband, such subversive scenes challenged the status quo. Over the past 160 years, psychologists, literary critics, and neuroscientists have mined Alice for meaning. Freudians see Oedipal imagery, structuralists see linguistic play, mathematicians find puzzles, neurologists find hallucinations. Why does this story remain compelling? Sigmund Freud never wrote specifically about Alice, but later psychoanalytic critics have read the story as a journey through the unconscious. The rabbit hole represents a descent into the id. The various creatures embody suppressed desires and fears. The Queen's decapitation commands symbolize castration anxiety. The Cheshire Cat's disembodied grin evokes the fragmented self. Jungians, meanwhile, interpret the story as an individuation quest. Alice must integrate aspects of her personality, logic, emotion, rebellion, to become whole. The book's dreamlike logic lends itself to such interpretations. Lewis Carroll was a logician who loved puns and paradoxes. His nonsense verse plays with homonyms, "mustard isn't a bird," and challenges the stability of language. In Jabberwocky, a poem from Through the Looking Glass, he invents new words, brillig, slithy toves, that still convey meaning through sound and context. This linguistic experimentation prefigures modernist literature. The collapse of meaning in the Knave's trial, where the evidence is a nonsensical letter, anticipates postmodern critiques of legal and political discourse. Words can be manipulated to justify injustice or to liberate the mind. Today, Alice continues to inspire artists, filmmakers, musicians, and fashion designers. Psychologists use Alice in Wonderland syndrome as a diagnostic term. Video game designers build worlds where players shift size. Activists adopt the Queen of Hearts as a symbol of irrational authority. The story speaks to anyone who has ever felt disoriented, oppressed, or curious. During the 1960s counterculture movement, Jefferson Airplane's song White Rabbit turned the book into an LSD anthem. In 2025, TikTok users create aesthetic Wonderland videos that pair dreamy visuals with commentary on mental health. Each generation finds its own reflection in the looking glass. The dark themes we've explored: drug abuse, industrial poisoning, war, class, injustice. Identity crises remain relevant because the structures that produced them persist. Our world still grapples with addiction, workplace hazards, political polarization, and social inequity. As dawn breaks, Alice finds herself lying on the riverbank with her head in her sister's lap. Was it all a dream? Her sister gently listens to the child describe Wonderland, and then imagines her own children retelling the tale. For the reader, waking from Wonderland raises unsettling questions about reality itself. Through our journey, we have uncovered how the whimsical adventures of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland are rooted in the social, medical, and political realities of 19th century Britain. The missing pages of Dodgson's diary remind us of how gossip and scandal can distort a story's origin. The opium-infused culture in which he wrote explains the surreal alterations of size and mood. The Mad Hatter's antics evoke the tragedy of industrial mercury poisoning. The Painted Roses recall civil wars that stained England's soil with blood. The absurd school lessons and trial lampoon rote education and class-biased justice. The very syndrome that bears the book's name describes real neurological experiences of distorted perception. Each piece of the puzzle reveals another layer of meaning. Perhaps the enduring power of Alice lies in its ability to hold a mirror to our own world. Just as the characters in the story ask riddles without answers, we too face questions about identity, power, addiction, and sanity that defy easy solutions. The book invites us to laugh at absurdity, to question authority, to empathize with the lost and the mad. It offers comfort to those who feel out of place and warns against complacency in the face of injustice. In 2025, as new discoveries about mental health, environmental toxins, and historical injustices emerge, Alice remains a relevant guide. The madness of Wonderland is not random. It is a carefully constructed critique of a society that often valued propriety over compassion, obedience over curiosity, and tradition over truth. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the dark meaning behind Alice's adventures. If you enjoyed this exploration, please like, subscribe, and share. And remember, when you find yourself among mad tea parties and painted roses, ask yourself, are you dreaming? Or are you simply seeing the world as it truly is? To truly understand why a man would write such a peculiar story as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, we must step into his shoes. What childhood memories, Personal fears and intellectual passions shaped the Reverend Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. Charles Dodgson was born on January 27, 1832, in Daresbury, Cheshire, the third of 11 children. His father, also named Charles, was a conservative Anglican clergyman who later became Archdeacon of Richmond. The Dodgson household was lively but strict. The children were educated at home and encouraged to read and recite. Charles suffered a stammer from a young age, a condition that made him self-conscious and shy in adult company. He found solace in storytelling, puzzles, and puppetry. When Charles was 12, the family moved to Croft on Tees, Yorkshire. Shortly thereafter, his mother died of a brain hemorrhage, plunging the household into grief. This early encounter with mortality is sometimes cited by biographers as the source of his fascination with the boundary between life and dreams. Dodgson's formal education began at Richmond Grammar School and later at Rugby School, where he excelled in mathematics and writing, but disliked the bullying and corporal punishment. After matriculating at Christ Church, Oxford, he earned a double first in mathematics and became a lecturer there. Teaching mathematics provided financial stability, though he considered it an intellectual duty more than a passion. Alongside his academic duties, he was ordained as a deacon in the Church of England, reflecting his family's religiosity. However, he never took priest's orders, perhaps due to his stammer, or perhaps because his imagination tugged him elsewhere. Dodgson was fascinated by language. He crafted riddles, anagrams, and acrostic poems for his siblings. In university, he read the works of Edward Lear, the pioneer of English nonsense verse. Lear's Book of Nonsense, 1846, collected limericks about fantastical creatures. Dodgson admired the way Lear used absurdity to subvert moralistic verse. In his own writing, he combined whimsy with logic. If language could misbehave, then logic could too. His essays on mathematics, including Euclid and his modern rivals and symbolic logic, explore the limits of reasoning. This interplay between strict logic and playful nonsense is the backbone of Alice. The Cheshire Cat states, "We're all mad here," hinting that madness and logic may be two sides of the same coin. From adolescence to late adulthood, Dodgson kept diaries. These journals recorded his daily activities, spiritual reflections, and creative ideas. They also reveal his intense self-scrutiny. He confessed his shyness and inability to make small talk, his religious doubts, and his occasional melancholia. In later life, he sometimes berated himself for not praying enough or for showing impatience with colleagues. The diaries were a private space where he could confront his demons and rationalize his behavior. After his death in 1898, relatives removed or destroyed several pages, especially those relating to the Liddell family. We know this because of numbering gaps and because Dodgson's nieces wrote notes summarizing the missing content. In addition to the June 27th, 1863 page discussed in Chapter 1, there are other missing entries covering events such as his disagreement with fellow mathematician Henry Liddell, his resignation from certain Oxford duties and personal health matters. Biographers have debated whether the excised material implicates Dodgson in scandal or simply reflects Victorian prudishness. Either way, the redactions have fueled modern curiosity, just as the Queen of Hearts shouts off with his head. Whenever things displease her, Dodgson's family, in erasing parts of his record, tried to remove discomforting truths from the narrative. Dodgson's interactions with children, especially girls, have sparked endless speculation. In Victorian society, middle-class adults often entertained children as intellectual equals. There was no concept of the teenager as a distinct phase. Dodgson's diaries record dozens of outings with children of friends. He wrote letters full of affection and whimsical drawings. Some were pure platonic mentorships. Others may have been tinged with romantic yearning for youthful innocence. A PBS article recounts that of roughly 3,000 photographs he took, over half depicted children, and around 30 photographs show children nude or semi-nude. The article notes that the images were made with parental consent and in a cultural context where cherubic nudes were considered artistic. Nevertheless, modern observers view them through the lens of today's understanding of child exploitation. Another Guardian piece highlights how his letters often expressed his love for the children. His whimsical writing may have channeled a complicated emotional life. The truth probably lies somewhere between innocence and impropriety, shaped by Victorian norms rather than modern ones. Much of the magic of Wonderland sprang from the imagination of three young sisters, Lorena, Alice, and Edith Liddell. Their lives and the family they belonged to provide the human context for the tale. Henry George Liddell was Dean of Christ Church and a classical scholar who co-authored the monumental Greek-English lexicon used by generations of students. The deanery at Christ Church was a grand residence that hosted prominent academics and artists. Henry's wife, Lorena, cultivated a cultured home with music, poetry, and social gatherings. The Liddell children, Lorena Charlotte, born 1849, Alice Pleasance, born 1852, and Edith Mary, born 1854, grew up amidst Oxford's intellectual elite. They were taught by governesses and were expected to become refined ladies. Victorian children of their class had strict routines, lessons in the morning, walks in the afternoon, reading and needlework. But they also delighted in stories told by visiting friends. On July 4th, 1862, Charles Dodgson and his friend, the Revd. Robinson Duckworth, took the Liddell sisters on a boating trip up the Thames from Oxford to Godstow. It was a warm, languid day, the golden afternoon that Dodgson immortalised in a prefatory poem. To entertain the girls, he spun a story about a curious girl named Alice who falls down a rabbit hole. The girls, particularly Alice, implored him to write it down. Dodgson later gifted the manuscript, titled Alice's Adventures Underground, to Alice Liddell as a Christmas present. The story subsequently underwent revision, gained new episodes, like the Mad Tea Party, and was published in 1865 as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, with illustrations by John Tenniel. Lorena, the eldest sister, was likely the model for the Lory bird, while Edith may be the eaglet in the chapter on the Caucus race. Dodgson's friendships with the sisters inspired characters and scenes, though his portrayal transcends literal biography. As mentioned earlier, speculation about Dodgson's relationship with the Liddells intensified when it was discovered that a diary page from June 1863 had been removed. The rumour that he proposed marriage to 11-year-old Alice in 1863 persists in popular culture, but the surviving summary contradicts this. The note suggests that Mrs. Liddell confronted Dodgson with gossip, claiming he was courting the governess or the teenage Lorena, Ina. At the time, Dodgson was 31 and Ina was 14. Victorian society sometimes permitted marriages between older men and teenage girls. Queen Victoria herself married at 20. but such matches were still sensitive. Dodgson wrote that he felt much hurt by the accusations, and he distanced himself from the family for several months. The rift eventually healed. By 1864 he was again visiting the deanery, but the friendships were never quite the same. The missing diary page thus marks a turning point in Dodgson's social life and reminds us how easily reputations could be tarnished by rumour. Alice Liddell grew up and married Reginald Hargreaves, a wealthy cricketer and soldier. They had 3 sons, 2 of whom died in World War I. In her later years, financial strain compelled Alice to sell the original manuscript of Alice's Adventures Underground at auction. It was purchased by an American collector and later returned to the British Library. Lorena married a barrister and moved away from Oxford. Edith died young at age 23 while holidaying in Greece. The sisters rarely spoke publicly about their role in inspiring Alice. For them, the story remained a cherished childhood memory rather than a lifelong celebrity identity. Their family narrative exemplifies the fragility of Victorian domestic bliss, publicly perfect, privately fractured. Photography was the new magic of the 1850s, a technology that could freeze time and capture innocence. Yet, as with many Victorian innovations, it revealed as much about the era's anxieties as it did about its ideals. When Dodgson took up photography in 1856, the dominant method was the collodion wet plate process. It required coating a glass plate with a mixture of collodion and silver nitrate, exposing it in a large camera while still wet and then developing it immediately. Exposures could last several seconds, so subjects had to remain perfectly still. Children fidgeted, yet Dodgson coaxed them into calm poses by telling stories and making them comfortable. He used natural light from studio windows and arranged backdrops reminiscent of classical paintings. In an age before Kodak's "you press the button, we do the rest," photography was an artisanal craft requiring chemical knowledge, artistic composition, and interpersonal skill. Victorian culture idealized children as embodiments of innocence. Paintings by artists like Sir Joshua Reynolds and the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood depicted cherubic toddlers with curly hair and rosy cheeks. Middle and upper-class parents commissioned photographs of their children to display in albums and parlours. Nude or semi-nude child portraits, often referencing cherubs or classical putti, were not necessarily eroticized. They were considered artful and pure. Many of Dodgson's photographs fit this genre. According to the PBS article, he produced about 3,000 images, over half of which depict children. Only about 30 surviving photographs show children nude or partially draped. Such images were created with parental permission and were circulated privately. The children were usually of friends or relatives, and the sessions were supervised by their parents. Nevertheless, the fact that most of his photographic oeuvre focused on children invites scrutiny. Photography also served as a memorial technology. In an era of high child mortality, Victorian England's under-5 mortality rate exceeded 150 per 1,000 births. Parents feared losing their offspring. Post-mortem photography, in which deceased children were posed to appear asleep, was common. Dodgson's portraits of living children thus captured youth in its fleeting prime. His diaries reveal a melancholic awareness that his child friends would soon grow up and leave him. He wrote of aching to hold back the years. This longing may have influenced the theme of arrested childhood in Alice. The perpetual tea party, the endless croquet game, and the unchanging trial. All depict worlds where time stands still, reflecting the nostalgic yearning of adults to preserve childhood innocence. The dark side of this nostalgia is the tendency to project adult desires onto children, to freeze them as objects rather than respect their autonomy. In the 20th and 21st centuries, cultural norms shifted. Many modern readers are uncomfortable with nude portraits of children regardless of context. Some critics label Dodgson a proto-child abuser, while others argue there is no evidence he acted inappropriately. His reputation oscillates between gentle uncle and creepy bachelor. Biographers emphasize the need to interpret his actions within his historical milieu, acknowledging both the era's different standards and the power imbalances inherent in adult-child relationships. Ultimately, Dodgson's photography stands at the intersection of art, affection, and controversy. It reveals the Victorian tension between celebrating childhood and controlling it, between preserving innocence and objectifying it. The hazy opium dreams of Wonderland were not confined to England's parlours. They were entangled with imperial ambitions and global commerce. While laudanum bottles lined domestic medicine cabinets, British merchants were shipping tons of opium to China. The East India Company cultivated opium in India and sold it at auctions to fund the purchase of tea and porcelain. When the Qing dynasty tried to stop the influx by confiscating opium cargoes, Britain launched the First Opium War, 1839-1842, to protect its right to free trade. The resulting Treaty of Nanking forced China to cede Hong Kong and open ports to British merchants. A second war, 1856-1860, further expanded these privileges. Thus, the very drug that soothed Victorian coughs at home also fueled wars abroad. This hypocrisy, condemning Chinese opium consumption while marketing laudanum as medicine at home, underlines the moral contradictions of the empire. In Britain, opium addiction cut across classes. Poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge and essayists like Thomas de Quincey wrote candidly about their laudanum habits. De Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, 1821, described the euphoria and nightmares induced by the drug. By the 1860s, social reformers began to worry about child mortality linked to opiate patent medicines. Newspaper campaigns exposed the sale of soothing syrups that killed infants. The British Pharmacopoeia of 1864 required the labelling of opium content, and the Pharmacy Act of 1868 restricted the sale of potent drugs to registered pharmacists. Even so, opium remained widely available for decades. The article on Victorian drug use states that before 1868, dangerous drugs like laudanum could be bought just like any other commodity, and that patent medicines containing opium were ubiquitous. By the time Carroll wrote Alice, the addictive properties of opium were acknowledged, but not yet fully regulated. Victorian literature is permeated with opium references. In Dickens's The Mystery of Edwin Drood, an opium den provides the setting for a murder mystery. In Wilkie Collins's The Moonstone, laudanum plays a pivotal role in a theft. Painters like Dante Gabriel Rossetti depicted languid figures in dreamscapes reminiscent of intoxication. Carroll's depiction of the hookah, smoking caterpillar, can be seen in this context. A hookah, often associated with Eastern opium use, evokes exoticism and introspection. The caterpillar's languid speech and elliptical questions, "Who are you?" echo the introspective state of drug-induced reverie. When he instructs Alice to eat the mushroom to control her size, He resembles a drug peddler promising to alter perception. Such imagery allowed Victorian authors to explore altered states of consciousness while maintaining plausible deniability. It's only a fairy tale after all. At first glance, Alice appears to revel in the joys of intoxication, the thrill of shrinking and growing, the delicious tarts, the bizarre logic. Yet deeper reading suggests caution. Alice often regrets her rash consumption of unknown substances. She cries torrents of tears that threaten to drown her. She forgets her lessons and recites parodies of moral poems. She struggles to control her temper. These narrative consequences hint that the escape offered by drugs or alcohol is illusory. The opium haze may be fun for a moment, but it leads to disorientation and loss of self. Victorian readers attuned to the drug debate would have recognized this cautionary undercurrent. The book invites the child reader to be curious, but also warns, don't drink from every bottle that says, "Drink me." In this way, Alice becomes an allegory for the perils of unexamined indulgence. Of all the transformations Alice undergoes, the most memorable is her physical shrinking and growing. Her body stretches like taffy, then crumples like a doll. Could these metamorphoses symbolize something more than fairy tale magic? Alice begins her adventure by shrinking small enough to fit through a door, and then growing so large her head hits the ceiling. She struggles to regulate her size with bits of mushroom and mysterious drinks. These episodes can be read as metaphors for puberty. Adolescence brings sudden growth spurts, awkward limbs, and a sense of alienation from one's changing body. The Cleveland Clinic's description of AIWS notes that disturbances in self-perception may cause people to feel their body or parts of it are too big or too small. Similarly, adolescents often perceive their bodies as monstrous or inadequate. When Alice laments, "Who in the world am I?" she voices the existential anxiety of adolescence. Alice's moods also fluctuate wildly. She laughs, then cries. She scolds herself, then reassures herself. The hormonal turbulence of puberty manifests in emotional swings. The novel's episodic structure, with each chapter presenting a new challenge, mirrors the developmental tasks of growing up, negotiating authority, learning social rules, managing impulses. Alice's exasperation with nonsensical adults reflects a teenager's frustration with hypocritical grown-ups. Early in the book, Alice grows so tall that she cries a pool of tears. Later, she shrinks and nearly drowns in the salt water. This scene evokes the overwhelming floods of emotion children experience when they lose control. In Victorian literature, tears often signify femininity and moral sensitivity. Carroll subverts this. Alice's tears become a physical hazard. She must swim through her own sadness alongside animals who hold a caucus race, a satirical take on parliamentary politics. The pool also anticipates the fluid imagery of the drug chapter's liquid that can drown or refresh. It is as if Alice's emotions have tangible consequences, forcing her to navigate an inner world made external. Beyond physical growth, the size changes represent social positioning. When Alice grows tall, she feels confident enough to reprimand the Queen's soldiers. When she shrinks, she becomes submissive. In the Victorian class system, children had to learn when to be big, assertive, and when to be small, obedient. Girls, in particular, were expected to shrink themselves metaphorically to make room for male authority. Alice flips this script by allowing her to expand to the point where she can see the absurdity of the court and call it out. Size becomes a metaphor for voice and agency. The dark humor lies in the instability of these positions. One can become marginalized or empowered by forces beyond one's control, whether mushroom, society, or hormones. We've met the Hatter and glimpsed the tragedies of mercury poisoning. But there is more to his story. The Hatter embodies a spectrum of historical illusions, from local eccentrics to factory workers' diseases. Felt hats were crafted through a laborious process. First, animal fur, often beaver, rabbit, or hare, was treated with a solution of mercurous nitrate to roughen the fibers, a stage called carroting because it turned the fur orange. Next, the fur was dried and beaten to separate the hairs, then gathered into a cone shape and steamed to mesh the fibers. The felt was then shrunk, dyed and shaped on a block before being stiffened and trimmed. Throughout this process, hatters inhaled mercury vapor, absorbed mercury through the skin, and sometimes ingested it via contaminated hands. Symptoms progressed from trembling hands, hatters' shakes, to shyness, memory loss, speech difficulties, and hallucinations. In advanced cases, victims exhibited severe mood swings and paranoia. The condition was so common in certain towns, such as Danbury, Connecticut, known as the Hat City, that entire communities of hatters displayed similar symptoms. Industrial medicine eventually recognized the syndrome, leading to improved ventilation and the replacement of mercury with safer chemicals by the mid-20th century. One of the possible real-life inspirations for the Hatter was Theophilus Carter, an eccentric furniture dealer in Oxford, known for his top hat and odd inventions. According to mathematician Martin Gardner, Carter was nicknamed the Mad Hatter in Oxford because he once displayed an alarm clock bed that tipped the sleeper onto the floor at a set time. Dodgson likely knew him, as they lived in the same town. Another candidate is Samuel Ogden, a Manchester hatter known as Mad Sam, mentioned in Gardner's research. Both men were local characters whose quirks provided fodder for Oxford gossip. Yet the phrase mad as a hatter existed long before them. A phrase etymology site notes that the expression appears in John Woolcott's writings between 1770 and 1819, and in William Makepeace Thackeray's The Newcomes, 1854, indicating that the association between hatters and madness predates Dodgson by combining the occupational disease of mercury poisoning with local eccentrics. Dodgson created a character who is both tragic and comic. The hatter's obsession with Time the Broken Watch and the perpetual tea time reflects industrial capitalism's regimentation of labour. In the early 1800s, time became standardized with the development of railways and factories. Workers were expected to adhere to strict schedules, and punctuality became a virtue. The White Rabbit, always checking his pocket watch and fretting about being late, is the embodiment of this new mechanical time. In contrast, the hatter is punished for murdering time and stuck at 6 o'clock forever. This tension between rushing and stagnation mirrors the anxiety of a society in transition from agrarian rhythms to industrial clocks. Through playful characters, Dodgson critiques how the march of time and the chemicals that enable mass production can warp human minds. The wonder of Wonderland lies in its cast of iconic creatures, each drawn from idioms, folklore, or social archetypes. Understanding their origins reveals new layers of meaning. The first creature Alice encounters is the White Rabbit. He carries a pocket watch, wears a waistcoat, and constantly worries about being late. In Victorian times, Pocket watches were luxury items that signaled middle-class respectability. The Industrial Revolution created timetables for trains and factories. People's lives became governed by clocks rather than natural cycles. Scholars interpret the White Rabbit as a caricature of anxious bureaucrats who follow schedules blindly. He leads Alice into Wonderland, much as bureaucratic systems draw individuals into labyrinthine procedures. His refrain, oh dear, I shall be too late," sets the tone for a story where time is fluid yet oppressive. The chase after deadlines still resonates in modern life. The Cheshire Cat is perhaps the most enigmatic character. He appears, disappears, and leaves only his grin behind. The phrase grinning like a Cheshire cat predates Carroll. It appears in John Woolcott's late 18th century satires and in Thackeray's mid-19th century novel, The Newcomes. Folklorists offer many theories for the phrase's origin: cheese moulds shaped like cats in Cheshire dairies, grinning cats carved on signboards, or the smiling lions on the coat of arms of the Earl of Chester. Whatever the source, Dodgson adapted the idiom into a character whose grin remains when his body vanishes. The cat's lines were all mad here, and if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there convey existential truths. He acts as a guide through madness, a disembodied voice of reason in a world of folly. His ability to defy the Queen's threats, "You're a cat, and there's no such thing as a beheading," underscores the irrepressible power of wit. The Mock Turtle in Alice's chapter. The Mock Turtle's story is a melancholy creature who looks like a turtle with the head of a calf. His name comes from mock turtle soup, a Victorian dish made from calves' heads as a cheaper substitute for green turtle meat. Real turtle soup was a delicacy imported from the Caribbean and eaten by the wealthy. Mock turtle soup became popular among the middle class. The dish itself was an imitation that attempted to mimic the texture and flavor of turtle. By making the mock turtle weep over his past, Dodgson satirizes nostalgia for bygone luxuries. The mock turtle's school lessons, reeling and writhing, ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision parody academic subjects. His dance, the lobster quadrille, mocks social dances and the etiquette of courtship. Through this character, the novel lampoons culinary fashions and educational fads. When we say someone is mad as a March hare, we reference the behavior of hares during their breeding season in March, when they leap and box with frenetic energy. The March hare in Alice displays manic chatter and eccentric etiquette, much like the Hatter. Pairing the Hatter with the hare at the same table amplifies the theme of madness. Their perpetual tea party is hosted on an endless March day, creating a loop of restlessness. The March hare's rudeness challenges Victorian social norms that valued politeness. Yet his behavior may also reflect the frustration of creatures trapped in social roles that no longer make sense. The caterpillar smoking a hookah atop a mushroom is the first non-human authority figure who interrogates Alice. Caterpillars are transitional creatures that metamorphose into butterflies or moths. In the context of the story, the caterpillar represents the liminal space between childhood and adulthood, between one identity and another. His blunt question, "Who are you?" forces Alice to reflect on her identity when she is most confused. Some readers see the caterpillar as a parody of philosophical dons at Oxford, who ask questions but offer no answers. Others interpret his unflappable calm as indicative of opium sedation. He gives Alice pragmatic advice. One side of the mushroom will make her grow, and the other will make her shrink, positioning him as a gatekeeper of bodily change. In Victorian natural history, metamorphosis symbolized the soul's potential to evolve. The caterpillar thus adds a dimension of natural science to the fairy tale world. Victorian England was captivated by crime, especially crimes committed by women. Courtrooms became theatres of morality, and newspapers turned trials into serial narratives. How does this obsession with scandal inform the legal farce in Alice? Poisoning was considered a particularly insidious crime because it could be carried out in the domestic sphere using substances available to housewives. The Midlands Historical Review article notes that the 1872 case of Christiana Edmonds, who poisoned boxes of chocolates, drew crowds of well-dressed women to her trial. The press worried that these women were enthralled and might share recipes. The same article observes that although the press framed poisoning as a female crime, men like William Palmer, hanged in 1856 for poisoning his friend with strychnine, also used poison. Other women committed violent acts considered masculine, such as Eliza Gibbons shooting her husband and Jane Colbert stabbing hers. The sensational focus on female poisoners reinforced Victorian gender stereotypes. Women were angels in the house or demons in the kitchen. This dichotomy mirrors the Queen of Hearts' capricious violence. In Alice, the trial of the Knave of Hearts for stealing tarts becomes a satire of how courts could magnify domestic misdemeanors into moral panics. Until the 1820s, England's Bloody Code listed over 200 crimes punishable by death, including theft of goods worth more than a shilling. Reforms gradually reduced capital offences, but severe penalties persisted. Transportation to Australia for 7 or 14 years remained common for petty theft well into the mid-19th century. Hard labour, public whipping and the pillory were sentences for crimes like swearing or vagrancy. While wealthy fraudsters might escape with fines, poverty became criminalised. The double standard noted in the Jack the Ripper tour article, where wealthy and influential people evaded harsh sentences, while lower classes faced severe punishment, reflects this inequality. Alice parodies the show, trials that exhibited power rather than justice. The jurors are literal playing cards, fungible and identical. The evidence is a meaningless poem. The verdict is predetermined. The king's instruction to consider the verdict before hearing the evidence echoes kangaroo courts throughout history. Alice's defiance, declaring that the court is nothing but a pack of cards, challenges the legitimacy of unjust authority. The Victorian era saw the expansion of prisons and lunatic asylums as tools of social control. Reformers like Elizabeth Fry campaigned for humane treatment, yet institutions remained overcrowded. The insane were often warehoused with criminals. Women who defied gender norms could be labelled hysterical and confined. Against this backdrop, Wonderland's characters appear mad but roam free. The Hatter and March Hare are at large. The Cheshire Cat vanishes at will. The Duchess is temporarily imprisoned in her kitchen but escapes. The only authority figure who seeks to imprison is the Queen, whose arbitrary sentences are a parody of both the Bloody Code and emergent psychiatric diagnoses. By depicting madness as a communal game rather than a crime, Alice implicitly questions the era's conflation of difference with deviance. Perhaps the greatest puzzle of Alice is its relationship to reality. Is it simply a dream, a satire, or an experiment in logic. How does the book's nonsensical language shape our understanding of truth? Both Alice's adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass are framed as dreams. The first book ends with Alice being woken by her sister. The second ends with the question, which dreamed it? Dreams allow contradictions to coexist. In a dream, one can grow tall, then short, talk to animals, and fly. By labeling the narrative a dream, Dodgson gave himself license to break the rules of Victorian realism. Yet the dream is not random. It follows the logic of puns, parodies, and paradoxes. Psychologists note that dream sequences often reflect the dreamer's waking concerns. For Dodgson, these concerns included the encroachment of adult rules on children's freedom, the absurdity of social hierarchies, and the instability of language. Dodgson delights in paronomasia, punning across meanings. The mouse offers to tell a tale, spelling pun, in the shape of a mouse tail. The mock turtle speaks of lessons that become less-ons. The griffin misunderstands commercial for committal, leading to non-sequiturs. These jokes not only entertain, but also critique the arbitrariness of signifiers. When words can mean their opposite or nothing at all, authority based on words, like the King's Rule 42, becomes suspect. The trial scene underscores this, as the evidence is a poem with lines of nonsense such as, "For he can distinctly pronoun che Shakespeare, Shakespeare, and Shakespeare." The jurors write down words without understanding them. Dodgson, a logician, thus demonstrates that legal and social orders built on language are fragile. In Our Own Time of Fake News and Misinformation, the book's warning about semantic instability feels prescient. Carroll's mathematical expertise informs many riddles. The Table of the Hatter's Watch, where time is tangled with manners, hints at set theory. The rule that I must be off means both departure and decomposition, evokes mathematical limits. In Through the Looking Glass, the White Queen lives backwards, remembering things that happen next week. This is a playful inversion of causality. The word through in the title invites meta-fictional reading. The story is not only about a looking glass, but is itself a mirror reflecting the act of storytelling. This reflexivity, stories about stories, anticipates modern literary theory. By embedding puzzles within puzzles, Dodgson encourages readers to be active problem solvers rather than passive consumers. No other Victorian children's book has permeated global culture like Alice in Wonderland. Its motifs recur in music, film, fashion, psychology, and internet memes. Tracing this influence reveals how interpretations of the story evolve with society. The first dramatization of Alice appeared only 3 years after the book's publication, with Dodgson's approval. Since then, countless stage adaptations have been produced, from pantomimes to Broadway productions. Walt Disney's 1951 animated film introduced generations of children to a pastel wonderland filled with singing flowers and friendly animals. In 2010, Tim Burton directed a live-action film that reimagined Alice as a young adult returning to overthrow a tyrannical Red Queen. Each adaptation reflects its era's concerns. Disney's version sanitized darker elements for mid-20th century family audiences. Burton's film injected postmodern CGI and battle sequences in line with fantasy epics. Musicians have drawn on Alice imagery, Jefferson airplanes. White Rabbit uses the hookah smoking caterpillar and size-changing mushrooms as metaphors for psychedelic drugs. Avril Lavigne's Alice channels teenage angst. Tom Waits composed a musical score for a stage production. Visual artists from Salvador Dali to Yayoi Kusama have illustrated Wonderland with surrealist and psychedelic flair. Fashion designers frequently reference Wonderland from haute couture dresses with playing card motifs to Lolita fashion in Japan, ironically named after a different controversial literary character, but incorporating Alice's pinafore and headband. Political cartoonists depict leaders as the Queen of Hearts, or Tweedledum and Tweedledee. During protests, signs reading, "We're all mad here," or "Down the rabbit hole," comment on the absurdity of political situations. Internet culture embraces Wonderland through memes, oversized teacups, glitchy rabbits, and quotes like "curiouser and curiouser." Conspiracy theorists use red pill and white rabbit imagery to claim hidden knowledge, not realizing their appropriation stems from a children's story. In therapy circles, people speak of their inner Alice when confronting disorienting life transitions. The story's flexibility allows it to be both a symbol of rebellion and a cautionary tale. Alice has been translated into over 170 languages. In some cultures, the idioms of the original lose their punch. Translators must invent new puns. In Japanese versions, the Cheshire Cat speaks in dialect. In Russian, the poems are recast to fit rhyming schemes. In Arabic, the hookah takes on local resonance. Scholars like translator Vladimir Nabokov have argued that translating Alice is the ultimate challenge because of the density of wordplay. Each translation becomes a new story, reflecting the target culture's humor and politics. For example, Chinese readers who have lived through the Cultural Revolution interpret the Queen's arbitrary executions differently from British readers. In this sense, Wonderland is a mirror not only for individuals, but for entire societies. Modern fans generate theories about hidden meanings in Alice. Some claim it encodes advanced mathematics or cryptography. Others see it as an allegory for the British class system. Still others view it through queer theory as a story about fluid identity and nonconformity. These interpretations, though speculative, underscore the richness of the text. They also show how readers continually reanimate the story to address contemporary issues. In an age of spin-offs and fan fiction, the fact that Alice invites such reinterpretation is a testament to its open-ended design. No single reading can exhaust its possibilities, because like the Cheshire Cat, the story can leave a grin behind even after the body vanishes. We have journeyed through diaries and drugstores, battlefields and hat factories, courts and classrooms, dreams and memes. Along the way, we discovered that the so-called madness of Wonderland is in fact a heightened perception of reality. In everyday language, madness connotes irrationality or loss of reason. Yet in Alice, madness reveals truths that reason cannot. The Mad Hatter, the March Hare, and the Cheshire Cat speak in riddles that expose hypocrisies. The Queen's arbitrary cruelty mirrors the capriciousness of real monarchs and judges. The logic puzzles highlight the arbitrary nature of social conventions. When we call someone mad for refusing to abide by unjust norms, are they crazy or courageous? In this sense, madness becomes a form of sanity in an insane world. The neurologist Oliver Sacks once wrote that hallucinations can offer insight into the workings of the brain. Similarly, Carroll's nonsense offers insight into the workings of society. Another recurring theme is the wisdom of children. Alice, though naive, often sees through adult pretensions. She questions the rules, asks for clarity, and calls out contradictions. Her ability to switch sizes suggests cognitive flexibility. The adults in Wonderland, be they animals or playing cards, are rigid, stuck in roles and phrases. By giving a child protagonist the power to interpret absurdity, Dodgson elevates the perspective of the young. He invites readers to cultivate curiosity and skepticism. At a time when Victorian culture valued obedience and rote learning, this message was quietly revolutionary. Today, when children's voices are increasingly amplified in climate activism and social justice movements, Alice's spirit lives on. One of the book's delights is that it resists a single moral. At the end of Through the Looking Glass, the White Knight sings a song about a little bill, a pun on both a name and a piece of legislation, and says, "The moral is if any moral there be, that is the moral of that." Carroll makes fun of didactic Victorian stories that hammered in explicit morals. Yet we can still draw lessons. Be wary of blindly following bottles labelled "Drink me." Question leaders who shout off with his head. Notice when your size is changing metaphorically depending on context. And remember that the border between sanity and madness is often drawn by those in power. As an author and mathematician, Lewis Carroll wove a tapestry of imagination that continues to fascinate. By drawing inspiration from his friendships with children, his love of puzzles, his awareness of social injustice, and his observations of contemporary science, he created a work that speaks across centuries. The dark meaning behind the madness is not a conspiracy hidden in missing diary pages. It is an invitation to look critically at the world and to embrace the wonderful, the weird, and the wise within ourselves. When you next dream, perhaps you will hear a voice asking, "Who are you?" Answer bravely, for you might be on the threshold of your own wonderland. In Chapter 5, we introduced Victorian schooling as rote learning, but the full story of 19th century education is richer and darker. To understand why Dodgson mocked lessons in Wonderland, we need to explore the classroom itself. In 1800s Britain, there was no comprehensive state education system. The wealthy hired governesses or sent their sons to grammar schools and public schools, which were in fact elite private boarding schools like Eton and Rugby. Curriculum for boys included Latin, Greek, mathematics, and sometimes modern languages. Girls were taught drawing, needlework, music, and French to prepare them for domestic roles. The poor were largely excluded. Philanthropic ragged schools, run by charities, offered basic literacy and religious instruction to destitute children. These schools emphasized discipline and moral reform. In 1870, the Elementary Education Act, Forster's Act, established school boards and aimed to provide universal elementary education. Attendance became compulsory for children aged 5 to 13, only after the Education Act of 1880. Until then, child labour took precedence. Many children worked in factories or mines and attended night school, if at all. The standard teaching method was the monitorial system, pioneered by Joseph Lancaster and Andrew Bell. Older or more advanced students, called monitors, taught younger pupils under a master's supervision. Classrooms held dozens or even hundreds of students. Lessons were recited in unison from memory. Textbooks contained moral tales emphasizing obedience, thrift, and piety. In the story, when the mock turtle laments his education in ambition, distraction, uglification, and derision, he parodies subject names like addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Teachers used the rod or cane to enforce discipline. Children who misbehaved might wear a dunce cap and stand in the corner. The fear of humiliation kept students silent. This environment stifled creativity and instilled conformity, precisely what Carroll satirizes when Alice is required to recite without comprehension. Education was often tied to churches, especially Anglican and nonconformist parishes. Catechism and Bible reading formed the backbone of curricula. Isaac Watts' Divine Songs for Children, published in 1715, remained popular, teaching lessons such as, "How doth the little busy bee improve each shining hour?" In Alice, this poem transforms into a crocodile devouring fish, undermining the moralistic message. By the mid-19th century, Sunday schools taught millions of children to read using the King James Bible. This literacy drive had the unintended consequence of exposing the working classes to radical texts like Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, alarming the establishment. The tension between moral instruction and intellectual empowerment underpins Alice. She is expected to learn polite verses, but ends up inventing subversive ones. Girls' education lagged behind boys. The prevailing ideology of separate spheres held that men belonged in public life and women in domestic. As a result, curricula for girls focused on accomplishments, music, drawing, sewing, rather than academic rigor. Pioneers like Emily Davies and Elizabeth Garrett Anderson challenged this. Davies co-founded Girton College, Cambridge's first residential college for women, in 1869. Anderson became Britain's first female physician. Campaigns for women's suffrage and property rights often intersected with demands for education reform. Within this milieu, Alice stands out. A young girl navigates philosophical questions, debates with adults, and asserts her opinions. She is neither angelic nor demure. She is curious, argumentative, and brave. Dodgson's portrayal subtly endorses female intellectual agency. Lewis Carroll's disdain for rote learning stems in part from his own experiences. At Rugby School, he suffered under the coach system, which drilled students to pass examinations rather than encourage understanding. Later, as a lecturer at Oxford, he witnessed rote methods being perpetuated. In response, he wrote teaching materials that emphasized problem-solving and logical analysis. His diaries reveal that he taught his students by posing puzzles and encouraging discussion rather than recitation. In the Alice books, he used parody to critique mindless memorization. The Caucus Race, where everyone runs in circles to dry off, lampoons classes in which children repeated lines without moving forward. The multiplication-based jokes demonstrate that true understanding requires knowing the system's rules, not just reciting products. By embedding these insights in a children's story, Carroll delivered an accessible critique of educational practices while delighting readers with absurdity. By the end of the century, educational reform movements had gained momentum. The 1891 Elementary Education Act made schooling free, and training colleges were established for teachers. Progressive educators like Charlotte Mason advocated for living books, nature study, and respect for children's intellect. However, rote learning has never fully disappeared. Standardized tests and lecture-based classrooms persist worldwide. The educational satire in Alice therefore remains pertinent. When we hear teachers or politicians call for more discipline and back to basics, we might recall the Mock Turtle's lessons and question whether more regimented schooling truly serves our children's curiosity. The painted roses in Wonderland hark back to a real civil war. But the historical War of the Roses is a tapestry of ambition, betrayal, and alliance. Understanding its complexity enriches our reading of red and white petals in the Queen's garden. The conflict known as the Wars of the Roses was not a single war, but a series of battles and conspiracies spanning 32 years. It began as a challenge by Richard, Duke of York, to the weak rule of King Henry VI, whose bouts of mental illness left a power vacuum. Richard claimed descent from Edward III and demanded to be recognised as heir. His supporters adopted the White Rose of York, possibly deriving from the rose badge of Edward III's second son. Henry VI's supporters, the Lancastrians, used the red rose of the House of Lancaster, though the emblem gained prominence later. The conflict saw shifting alliances. The powerful noble Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, nicknamed the Kingmaker, switched sides, deposing and restoring kings at will. Battles like St Albans, Towton, Tewkesbury, and Bosworth Field decimated aristocratic families. The estimated 28,000 dead at Towton, as noted earlier, testifies to the war's brutality. The rose symbols were partly retrospective inventions. While some nobles wore roses on livery badges, contemporary accounts rarely refer to the conflict as the War of the Roses. Shakespeare's Henry VI's plays, written in the 1590s, popularised the image of nobles plucking red or white roses to declare allegiance. Henry VII, eager to legitimise his Tudor dynasty after winning at Bosworth, merged the roses into the Tudor rose. This emblem presented his reign as the reconciliation of warring houses and was carved into buildings and worn on clothing. In this sense, painting white roses red in Alice parodies the rewriting of history, the gardeners, society, alter reality to please the sovereign, Henry Tudor, or the Queen. It suggests that national unity often depends on cosmetic changes rather than structural healing. Beyond the nobles, ordinary soldiers and civilians suffered. Harvests were destroyed, towns plundered, and populations displaced. The violence left psychological scars. Chroniclers wrote of ominous eclipses and comets. Preachers proclaimed divine judgment. After the wars, many aristocratic estates lay in ruin, enabling the rise of the gentry class and paving the way for the Tudor centralised monarchy. The memory of fratricide influenced subsequent English politics. Centuries later, during the English Civil War of the 1640s and the Glorious Revolution of 1688, pamphleteers invoked the Wars of the Roses to warn against internecine conflict. When Carroll wrote Alice in the 1860s, the United States was emerging from its own civil war. The universal trauma of civil strife would have resonated with readers on both sides of the Atlantic. In Wonderland, those tasked with painting the roses are not soldiers, but playing cards, transient, flimsy symbols of leisure. Their fear of decapitation exaggerates the gulf between trivial offence and fatal punishment. The colour red, associated with blood and Lancaster, becomes mere paint. The Queen's readiness to order executions for gardening mistakes mocks leaders who wage war over symbols. By demoting historic armies to a farce, Carroll criticises how rulers can trivialise human life. When modern politicians wrap themselves in flags and logos, we should remember the gardeners frantically painting flowers to avoid arbitrary wrath. The War of the Roses continues to appear in popular culture. Shakespeare's plays, Philippa Gregory's novels, the TV series The White Queen and Game of Thrones, which loosely draws on the York-Lancaster feud. The latter's War of the Five Kings features heraldic houses and bloody weddings reminiscent of the historical conflict. In football, matches between Yorkshire and Lancashire teams are sometimes called Roses Derbies. The enduring fascination underscores how a medieval power struggle still shapes English identity. By sneaking the rose painting gag into a children's book, Carroll both playfully educates and subtly critiques his nation's past. Lewis Carroll was first and foremost a mathematician. His love of numbers and logic permeates the seemingly illogical world of Wonderland. Let us explore some of these hidden mathematical jokes and philosophical paradoxes. The geometry of Wonderland defies Euclid. Alice's fall down the rabbit hole seems endless, suggesting a descent through non-finite space. The corridor of doors behind the small door resembles a fractal, with infinite repetition of similar patterns. In the chapter Advice from a Caterpillar, the insect instructs Alice to eat one side of a mushroom to grow and the other to shrink. She must carefully adjust bites to reach normal height. This is like solving an algebraic equation by iterative approximation. Dodgson's experience teaching algebra is evident. He demonstrates how small changes in input produce significant changes in output, cautioning against overshooting the solution. At the tea party, the Hatter poses the riddle, "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" When Alice eventually asks for the answer, he says he doesn't know. The riddle functions as a circular question, an inquiry with no set answer that invites creative reasoning. Over the years, people have proposed solutions, because Poe wrote on both. The concept is similar to a Gödel sentence, a statement that cannot be proven or disproven within its own system. Dodgson playfully anticipates Gödel's incompleteness theorem by demonstrating that some questions remain undecidable. The Hatter also claims to have murdered time, implying that time is personified and can be killed. In physics, time can be relative and subject to dilation. Hatter's watch measures days rather than minutes, confusing units. This pun prefigures dimensional analysis. Mixing incompatible units leads to nonsensical results. As mentioned earlier, the mock multiplication table works in different bases. Carroll used other base jokes in his letters. He once wrote 1 in the morning and 8 in the evening, 1 in base, 9 equals 8 in base 10. He enjoyed binary, octal, and duodecimal systems. In Through the Looking Glass, the White Queen offers Alice jam tomorrow and jam yesterday, but never jam today. Linguistically, the rule refers to the Latin word I am meaning now, which appears only in the past and future tenses, not the present. Mathematically, it suggests a set that includes all days except the present, a paradoxical promise always deferred. These jokes encourage readers to question default number systems and to see everyday language as a system with its own rules. Carroll's interest in symbolic logic led him to write logic textbooks using colored diagrams. In Alice, he mocks faulty reasoning. In the trial, the king asserts that all people more than a mile high must leave court. Alice counters that she is not a mile high and points out that the rule does not apply to her. The king then asserts that rules can be made up as one goes along. Carroll uses this to illustrate category errors, applying a law to the wrong class of objects. Another example is the exchange with the pigeon, who thinks Alice is a serpent because she eats eggs. The pigeon erroneously assumes that creatures that eat eggs are serpents. It generalizes from its limited experience. This highlights the fallacy of hasty generalization. By embedding logical fallacies in dialogue, Carroll teaches reasoning skills implicitly. Alice's constant question, "Who am I?" raises the philosophical problem of identity through change. Her body changes size, her memories fade and return. When she meets the caterpillar, he asks her to recite, "You are old, Father William," which is itself a parody of Robert Southey's poem. The young man in the poem questions how Father William can stand on his head or balance his eels on his nose. Father William replies that he used to be reckless, but now sells ointment. The poem suggests that identity shifts with age and experience. In mathematics, a function can be transformed, yet remain the same function under a change of variables. Carroll invites us to consider whether there is a core self independent of transformations. This metaphysical question transcends the Victorian context and continues to resonate with readers navigating personal change. After the success of Alice's adventures in Wonderland, Carroll wrote a sequel that is equally rich in symbolism. While Wonderland is structured around cards, Through the Looking Glass is built upon chess. Its world is a mirror of our own, yet everything is reversed. The book opens with Alice playing with her kittens, Kitty and Snowdrop. She wonders what the world is like on the other side of the mirror. When she climbs onto the mantelpiece, she steps through and finds that the chess pieces in the drawing room are alive. The mirror motif suggests the idea of inversion: left becomes right, back becomes front. In the mirror world, logic is reversed. One must run as fast as possible just to stay in place, as the Red Queen explains. This is a commentary on Victorian progress despite rapid industrial growth and empire. Many felt they were making no moral headway. Mirror images also invert written text. Carroll actually printed a mirror poem called Jabberwocky in the first edition, forcing readers to hold the book up to a mirror to read it. This playful printing technique engages readers physically with the book's objecthood. In Looking Glass Land, Alice is informed by the Red Queen that the world is a giant chessboard. She is a white pawn who must reach the 8th square to become a queen. This structure maps the book's chapters. Each move corresponds to a space on the board. Pawns, usually the least powerful pieces, can only move forward and are often sacrificed, yet if they reach the far side, they become queens. This metaphor resonates with Victorian social mobility, particularly for young women. If Alice moves correctly, she can gain power. However, each square presents obstacles: living flowers that criticize, Tweedledum and Tweedledee who fight over a broken rattle, a gnat who introduces bread and butterflies, and a train whose passengers speak in riddles. The book thus critiques a meritocratic narrative by showing the randomness of the challenges. The Red Queen is often conflated with the Queen of Hearts, but they are different characters. The Red Queen is cold, logical, and rule-bound. She tells Alice, "Here you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place." This line inspired evolutionary biologist Lee Van Valen's Red Queen hypothesis, which posits that species must constantly adapt to survive against evolving competitors. In the book, the Red Queen embodies bureaucratic efficiency taken to an absurd extreme. The White Queen, in contrast, is scatterbrained and lives backwards in time. She offers comfort to Alice, but also shows the absurdity of memory and prophecy intertwining. Together, they illustrate two extremes of Victorian womanhood: rigid propriety and sentimental eccentricity. They may also represent Queen Victoria's public image, red for regal authority, and her private, grief-stricken life after Prince Albert's death, white for mourning. Looking Glassland is full of twins and opposites. Tweedledum and Tweedledee recite the poem The Walrus and the Carpenter, which itself features dual characters representing exploitation, the walrus, and industry, the carpenter. The twins argue but are indistinguishable, suggesting that opposing sides in a conflict may be identical beneath rhetoric. The lion and the unicorn fight for the crown, but stop to eat plum cake. These vignettes satirize political battles that revolve more around pomp than substance. The mirror world also invites the possibility that our reality is someone else's dream. At the end, Alice finds the Red King asleep and wonders whether she is merely a figure in his dream. This question dissolves the boundary between subject and object, dreamer and dreamed. It echoes Eastern philosophies like Zhuangzi's butterfly dream and invites readers to question the solidity of their own world. One of the most celebrated poems in Through the Looking Glass is Jabberwocky. Written in portmanteau words like slithy, slimy lithe, and mimsy, miserable flimsy. It tells of a hero's battle with the fearsome Jabberwock. Though initially nonsensical, the poem conveys a narrative through sound and grammar. Carroll demonstrates that we can derive meaning from context, even when we do not know all the words. This experiment in linguistic creativity influenced writers like James Joyce and contributed to the field of semiotics. It also echoes children's language acquisition, where kids infer meaning from phonetic patterns. By placing this poem within a mirrored book, Carroll mirrors the process of language learning itself. Many readers note that Through the Looking Glass feels more melancholic than Alice's adventures in Wonderland. The humour is sharper, the characters are more threatening. The conclusion is ambiguous. In the final scene, Alice shakes the Red Queen into the shape of a kitten, but she cannot decide whether the world she left behind was hers to begin with. Perhaps Dodgson's own mood had darkened, his mother had died, his friendship with the Liddles had changed, and he faced growing criticism of his photography. The chess structure emphasizes predetermined moves, hinting at determinism. Unlike Wonderland, where Alice can defy the court, Looking Glass Land implies that the rules are made elsewhere. This shift reflects the Victorian transition from romantic optimism to fin de siècle anxiety. Even in fantasy, the constraints of society press in. Alice's influence extends beyond literature into the realms of psychology, neuroscience, and even political science. Scholars across disciplines borrow metaphors from Wonderland to describe complex phenomena. The expression going down the rabbit hole has entered everyday language to describe descending into a deep, often confusing exploration. Psychologists use it to explain cognitive dissonance and radicalization once an individual starts exploring a new idea, be it a conspiracy theory or a spiritual practice. Each new piece of information leads to another, and the explorer loses sight of the original context. Social media algorithms exacerbate this, funneling users into rabbit holes of extreme content. While Carroll's original rabbit hole led to a world of imagination, modern rabbit holes can lead to misinformation and polarization. Recognizing when we are tumbling beyond reason is a critical media literacy skill. As mentioned in Appendix O, the Red Queen inspired the Red Queen hypothesis in evolutionary biology. Formulated by Lee Van Valen in 1973, It proposes that species must continually evolve to survive because competitors, parasites, and predators are also evolving. The phrase running to stay in the same place, spoken by the Red Queen, succinctly expresses this co-evolutionary arms race. Biologists use the metaphor to explain why genetic diversity is beneficial. Sexual reproduction shuffles genes, helping organisms keep pace with parasitic threats. Thus, a line from a children's story aids scientists in framing complex ecological dynamics. The neurological condition, named after Alice AIWS, continues to intrigue researchers. Beyond the causes listed earlier, studies have examined its relationship to migraines, epilepsy, and infections like Epstein-Barr. A 2024 study in Scientific American reported that a surprising 16 of migraine patients experienced AIWS symptoms, suggesting it may be underdiagnosed. During the COVID-19 pandemic, case reports linked AIWS episodes to post-viral inflammation. Advances in neuroimaging have allowed scientists to map disruptions in the temporoparietal junction, a brain region involved in body schema. Therapists treating depersonalization and derealization sometimes reference Alice to help patients articulate their sensations. Understanding AIWS not only sheds light on rare perceptual disorders, but also informs our understanding of consciousness itself. Activists and social theorists occasionally invoke Wonderland imagery to critique power structures. The Occupy Wall Street movement used the slogan "Welcome to Wonderland" to highlight financial absurdity. Feminist scholars read Alice as a proto-feminist heroine who questions patriarchal authority. Queer theorists find resonance in her fluid identity and rejection of binary logic. Environmentalists liken the Queen's croquet game, where flamingos are used as clubs and hedgehogs as balls, to the exploitation of living creatures for human amusement. By harnessing the surreal, these movements encourage audiences to see the familiar world anew. Wonderland becomes a space where radical imagination is possible, where societal rules can be rewritten. Cognitive scientists study why readers and viewers become immersed in fictional worlds like Wonderland. The brain's default mode network, active during daydreaming and mind-wandering, engages when we follow stories. Neuroscientist Mary Ann Wolfe notes that reading complex narratives builds empathy and critical thinking. When children hear Alice's adventures, they practice perspective, taking they imagine being small, then large. They empathize with characters who misbehave. MRI studies show that reading about physical actions activates similar motor regions in the brain as performing them. Thus, Alice's transformations may literally stretch readers' neural pathways. In an educational context, this bolsters the argument for literature as a tool for cognitive development. That a Victorian fantasy has become a lens for neuroscience, evolutionary theory, political activism, and internet culture speaks to its adaptability. Alice continues to inspire because her story is fundamentally about curiosity and courage qualities, essential for scientific inquiry and social progress. As we continue down our own rabbit holes, whether researching a rare disorder or navigating a social movement, let us remember to carry with us Alice's combination of skepticism and wonder. In doing so, we ensure that our explorations expand our understanding rather than trap us in madness.